20 years ago, the kings of Greece united their forces against Troy. The walled city stood defiant across the sea, and the war seemed endless. 10 years the siege lasted, 10 years of blood and death without result, until Odysseus, king of Ithaca, conceived a plan, the wooden horse that would give them victory. Odysseus didn't want to go to that war. He had a newborn son, Telemachus, and a wife whom he loved, Penelope. But he had sworn to defend Menelaus' honor when all of Helen's suitors promised to protect their marriage. An oath is sacred to the gods, and when Paris abducted Helen, Odysseus had no choice. After Troy's fall, the Greek ships sailed toward their lands. Some, like Agamemnon, found death upon reaching their homes. Others, like Menelaus, wandered through strange seas before returning. But Odysseus' fate was the cruelest. 20 years away from Ithaca, lost in a labyrinth of islands and monsters. First, he came to the land of the Cicones, where his men plundered mercilessly and awakened the vengeance of its inhabitants. Then, the lotus eaters almost made them forget the way home with their sweet poisoned flowers. On the island of the Cyclops, Odysseus blinded Polyphemus, Poseidon's son, to escape from his cave. This act sealed his fate. The god of the sea swore that Odysseus would never return home without suffering. Misfortunes multiplied. On Iolus' island, he received a bag with all winds except the one that would take him to Ithaca, but his men, believing it concealed treasure, opened it and unleashed a tempest. The Laestrygonians devoured part of his crew. The sorceress Circe turned his companions into pigs before becoming his lover. He descended to Hades to consult the seer Tiresias about his return. He survived the deadly song of the sirens tied to his ship's mast. He sailed between Scylla and Charybdis, where he lost 6 more men. On Helios' island, his hungry sailors sacrificed the sacred cattle of the sun god, causing the destruction of his last ship. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to the wreckage until reaching Calypso's island. The nymph welcomed him, loved him, and offered him immortality, but she couldn't give him the only thing he desired: to return to Ithaca. 7 years he remained captive of her hospitality, weeping each day for his lost homeland. Meanwhile, in Ithaca, Penelope resisted. At first, everyone believed Odysseus would soon return. Then that he had died in Troy. Finally, that he had drowned at sea. The nobles of Ithaca and nearby islands began courting her, installing themselves in the palace, consuming the royal family's goods. 108 suitors who ate, drank, and behaved as if they were already the owners. Penelope devised a stratagem to gain time. She promised to choose a new husband when she finished weaving a shroud for Laertes, Odysseus' elderly father. Each day she wove, each night she undid her work. For 3 years, she maintained the deception until a servant betrayed her. Telemachus grew up watching these men devour his father's estate. Too young to confront them, too inexperienced to govern, he helplessly observed the slow destruction of his home. The suitors treated him with contempt, like a child who deserved no respect. And it is here that the gods finally intervene. Athena, always protective of Odysseus for his cunning and intelligence, can no longer bear his suffering. On Mount Olympus, she approaches Zeus's throne to intercede for the wandering hero. Sing, O Muse, the story of the cunning man, the one who roamed the seas, the one of 1,000 wiles, the one who saw strange lands and learned from their peoples. Tell us of Odysseus, who after the fall of Troy wandered, trapped by the fury of the gods. Tell us how, while the rest of the Achaeans returned home, He fought against waves and storms, against monsters and enchantments, and how his heart never ceased to yearn for Ithaca, the island where a son grew up without a father and a wife, resisted the siege of men who wanted her as their own. But why do the gods keep him far from his home? Why is his fate an open wound? Listen, O Muse, and let his story be told again. The gods were assembled on Olympus. Zeus, seated on his throne, surveyed the earth. His thoughts were not on one man, but on all that was happening among mortals. Someone had to die, someone had to be born, and someone offered sacrifices. So, it was always. Athena approached. She carried her spear in one hand, and with the other she gathered up her robe. "Zeus, are you going to let Odysseus continue to suffer?" she said bluntly. The god looked away from the earth and looked at his daughter. "You know why she is there. Don't forget that. His misfortune began when he blinded the son of Poseidon." Athena did not look away. Hasn't she suffered enough? He has spent years on that island, far from home, held by Calypso. He is a good man. He has honored the gods. Zeus took a golden cup and drank. He was not an easy god to convince. Mortals always suffer. They are always lost at sea, always dying in wars, always begging for help. He is not the only one who has wandered far from home. But you can help him. Zeus sighed. "It's all right. Hermes will go to Calypso and tell her to let him go, but he must return alone. His return will be difficult." Athena wasted no more time. "In the meantime, I will go to Ithaca." Zeus let her go. Thus, Athena descended to the world of men. Ithaca is not the same without Odysseus. 20 years have passed since he left for Troy, and his house, once the center of the island, is full of strangers. In the corridors, the laughter of men who have no right to be there. On the tables, food that doesn't belong to them. Penelope resists as best she can, but it's getting harder every day. Telemachus watches them from the shadows. He is not old enough to expel them, nor strong enough to face them. They treat him like a child, although he knows he is not. He listens to their taunts, how they talk about his mother, how they drink without paying for anything. If his father were here, none of them would dare touch a single jug of wine. But Odysseus is not here, and no one knows if he is still alive. That evening, as the sun begins to set, a traveler arrives in Ithaca. His clothes are clean, although he has crossed the sea. His bearing is different from that of the merchants or fishermen who usually pass through the island. He walks leisurely, watching the men drinking outside the palace as if he were sizing each one up. In the hall, Telemachus sits alone, while the suitors shout and drink as if nothing matters. His mother has locked herself in her rooms. A servant, noiselessly, sets a cup of wine in front of him. Telemachus takes it unwillingly. It is then that the traveler enters. The men ignore him at first, but he does not look at them. His attention is on Telemachus. "Cheers, son of Odysseus," he says, taking a seat beside him. Telemachus watches him cautiously. His father taught him to welcome strangers well. Before answering, he gestures to the handmaids to pour wine. "Welcome, stranger, welcome, stranger. Have you come from far away?" The man accepts the cup and holds it in his hand before speaking. "I am Mentis, son of Anchialus, an old friend of your father's." Telemachus tenses. For as long as he can remember, many have spoken of his father. Some say he died at Troy, others that he drowned in the sea, others that he was taken by gods and will never return. "They say many things about him," he replies, setting the cup down on the table. "But the truth is that no one knows. Mentes watches him carefully. Your father lives." Telemachus feels the room close around him. He leans forward a little, though his expression doesn't change. Where? Mentis doesn't answer immediately. He takes a sip of wine and sets the glass aside. He is not here, but he is still alive, held, far from Ithaca. If the gods allow it, he will return. But you can't wait around. Telemachus straightens up. Waiting for what? The traveler lowers his voice, but not as if he were hiding something, but as one who delivers advice that must be understood. Your house is full of men who should not be here. Your mother still holds out hope, but they will not go willingly. Telemachus, they wait to see if you are the son of Odysseus, or just the boy who grew up without him. Telemachus clenches his fists on his knees. Those words outweigh any insult from suitors. And what am I supposed to do? I'm not my father. Mentis smiles. No, but you have his blood. Call an assembly and confront these men. Don't ask them to leave. Tell them to leave. And then go in search of news of your father. Ask in Pylos, in Sparta. Some have seen things you have not seen. Telemachus takes a deep breath. This is all too much. He never thought this moment would come. Mentis stand up. It is time. Before Telemachus can say anything else, the stranger walks away. He leaves the palace and walks into the darkness of the night. But Telemachus does not see him disappear. He does not see how, on the hill, Athena regains her divine form and rises into the sky. Telemachus remains seated, his hands on his knees. In the hall, the suitors continue with their laughter and their jokes, as if nothing had changed. But something has changed. The early morning lights barely touched the roofs of the palace when Telemachus came out of his rooms. Outside, the air smelled of warm bread and old smoke. He paused for a moment at the entrance to the great hall. Inside, the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses reminded him that his father's house was not his own. The suitors were there, as always, stretched out on the benches, their robes loose and their mouths full. They helped themselves to the tenderest meat, drank the best wine, and talked among themselves as if the world belonged to them. One of them, Antinous, noticed their presence and made a mocking sign to him. "Ah, the son of the absent one! Have you slept well, prince? I hope the noise of our feast was not too much for you." Some laughed. Telemachus felt a burning in his throat. He did not answer. Instead, he crossed the hall without looking at them. His mother, Penelope, was in her room, knitting. Every day she knitted, and every night she undid her work to save time. She did it for him, though she never said so. That morning, Telemachus walked to the square where the agora of Ithaca awaited him with its worn stone floor. It had been years since anyone had called an assembly. The last time his father had been there. Now the dais seemed too big, and the crowd looked at him curiously, as if they didn't know what he was doing there. He took a deep breath and went up. "Citizens of Ithaca," he said, "I ask you to listen." The voices gradually lowered. "My father left 20 years ago. First the war, then the sea. We do not know if he is alive or dead, but you do know what is happening in his home." He looked at the elders of the city, the same ones who had fought alongside Odysseus. He turned to the young men, those who had grown up without knowing him. "My home is taken over by men who drink our wine, eat our meat, and say they want to marry my mother. And you, who knew my father, allow it." Some heads bowed, but in the front rows Antinous burst out laughing. "Ah, naive boy! And what do you want us to do? Expel us? Do you have men, swords, an army to obey you?" Telemachus felt anger. "If my father were here—" "But he's not," Eurymachus interrupted him, "and he's not coming back." Silence. Telemachus stepped down from the dais. There was nothing more to say. He walked through the crowd until a voice stopped him. Telemachus. It was Mentor, his father's old friend. You didn't win the assembly, but you woke something up. Don't wait for what's yours to be returned to you. Go and get it. That night when the palace slept, Telemachus went out secretly. His journey had just begun. The salty breeze hit his face as the ship moved forward. Telemachus had never left Ithaca, but there he stood, hands steady on the wood, watching the island become a distant dot on the horizon. Telemachus thought of his mother, of how she would have taken his departure. He had no time to say goodbye. He knew Penelope would have held him back, fearful that the same thing would happen to him as to her husband. Pylos appeared at dawn, with its stone walls and a harbor full of ships. As she descended, she saw the aged Nestor surrounded by his sons. The king of Pylos, who had fought beside his father at Troy, received him with the hospitality of ancient times. You are the son of Odysseus, he said with a smile. I see it in your eyes. Telemachus felt a weight in his chest. No one in Ithaca spoke of his father with respect. There he was, a forgotten man, a shadow of his former self. But in Pylos, he was still remembered as a hero. During the banquet, Nestor spoke of the war. He spoke of Odysseus's cunning, of his plans in Troy, and of how he deceived the Trojans with his disguise as a beggar. Telemachus listened in silence, absorbing every word. When the time came to ask about his whereabouts, her throat felt dry. My father, he began. What happened to him after the war? Nestor looked down. Your father was one of the last to leave. He didn't come back to us. No one knew what became of him after he sailed. But if anyone can tell you more, it's Menelaus. The old king offered him horses and a chariot to continue his journey. Telemachus accepted, though he had never guided one before. In the morning, the sun was rising behind the hills of Pylos when Telemachus climbed into the chariot. Athena, disguised as Mentor, accompanied him. Do not be afraid, she said. Go on. The road to Sparta was long, but Telemachus did not complain. The land stretched out before him, unknown and vast. Dust rose with every pounding of the hooves. On the horizon, Sparta awaited him. The horses stopped in front of Menelaus's palace in Sparta. Telemachus, exhausted from the journey, surveyed the massive stone structure. The evening sun made the walls gleam as if they still held the gold plundered from Troy. From inside came laughter and the sound of clinking glasses. We have arrived, said his companion Pisistratus, son of Nestor. They passed through the doors and were greeted by servants who led them to the banquet hall. Telemachus unwillingly gasped. He had never seen anything like it. Lion skins covered the seats, plates were filled with meats and fruits, and in the center of the table a large jug of wine was passed from hand to hand. Menelaus was seated on the throne. His hair, reddish and curly, fell over his neck. Helen, his wife, was at his side, wearing a dress that reflected the light of the lamps. When he saw them, he bowed his head curiously. Who are these travelers? Menelaus asked, setting down his cup. We come from Pylos, answered Pisistratus. This is Telemachus, son of Odysseus. Helen rose slowly. Her eyes swept over Telemachus' face. He looks like him, she whispered, like his father. Telemachus felt something inside him. He was not used to being looked at like this, with such interest. Menelaus invited him to sit down. When everyone resumed eating, the king began to speak. Odysseus. Not a day goes by that I don't remember him. He was the most cunning of the Achaeans. If it weren't for him, Troy would still be standing. He took a sip of wine and continued. After the war, the winds separated us all. I spent years wandering before returning to Sparta. But one day in Egypt I caught the old man of the sea, Proteus. He told me many things, but the most important was this: Odysseus is still alive. Telemachus felt the blood pounding in his ears. Where is he? On an island, prisoner of a nymph named Calypso. She keeps him in her cave and offers him immortality, but he only wants to return to Ithaca. Telemachus clenched his fists. His father was alive but trapped. Helena smiled and asked the servants to bring a chest. "Take this," she said, handing him a purple cloak embroidered with gold stars. "When you see your father, let him wear it as a king." That night, Telemachus could hardly sleep. The roof of Menelaus's palace seemed far away, as if he were in another world. In the morning, he said goodbye. The horses returned to the road. Pisistratus looked at him. "You look like someone else. My father is alive. Now I must return." Sparta was left behind. The sea stretched out in all directions, blue, immense. Telemachus stood at the bow, his face to the wind. Ithaca was nearer, but in the palace the suitors had already been alerted to his return. "The puppy has grown up," said Antinous with a crooked smile. "Now he thinks he can do something against us." Eurymachus took a long drink of wine before replying. "If he comes back with news of Odysseus, it will be trouble. We can't let him get strong." Antinous leaned back in his chair. "We know he will return by sea. We can wait for him in the straits and attack him before he arrives." The others laughed, raising their glasses. Meanwhile, Telemachus slept on the deck of his ship. He dreamed of his mother, of Ithaca, of a broad-backed man walking in the mist. He could not see his face, but he knew it was him. When she awoke, the sun was already high. She sat up and looked at the horizon. It was not long now.